folks. This is Matt Chrisman here, bringing you another edition of The Inebriated Past, a Independence Day edition, and fittingly, we're going to talk about the American party system, and specifically how the American party system has evolved and its relationship to everyone's favorite document, the United States Constitution. And the main argument I'm going to be making today is that there is a fundamental conflict between the constitutional system of government that we have been bequeathed by our genius founding fathers and the party system that has arisen to work within it. And the thing that made me think about this, and the thing that made me think it was worth talking about, really was that hilarious quote that Joe Biden had a few weeks ago about James Eastland, the monstrous, racist, segregationist Mississippi senator who he was in the Senate with in the 70s. The quote is, if you've forgotten it, "I know the new left tells me that this is old-fashioned, but guess what? If we can't reach a consensus in our system, what happens? It encourages the demands the abuse of power by the president. That's what it does. You have to be able to reach consensus under our system, our constitutional system of separation of powers. I was in a caucus with James O. Eastland. He never called me son. He always called me boy. The point I'm making is you don't have to agree. You don't have to like the people in terms of their views, but you just simply make the case, and you beat them." So everyone got mad at him, obviously, because he was praising a monstrous, horrifying racist who spent his entire career in government trying to prevent black Americans from reaching any kind of statutory or social equality. And obviously that is true. But I want to point to a different thing about this quote that I think is even more in its way revealing, not just about how Biden is a fossil who does not realize what's happening and doesn't understand the political world that he's in anymore, but how the conventional wisdom of, I would say, the vast majority of people in Congress, in government, at all levels, and certainly in the journalism sphere and in the punditocracy, understand politics. The thing that is important about that quote is the thing about Eastland is that he was a Democrat. Biden is talking about the need to reach across the aisle and to get to do the kind of brass tacks compromise that gets things done. But he was talking, when talking about Eastland, about a fellow member of the Democratic Party, which he was also a member of at the time and still is. And that shows that he does not understand how things have changed, specifically in the last 10 years, since the Obama administration, really, since about 2008, 2009. It fails to recognize that the era of compromise that he is hearkening back to, and that so many establishment political figures are hearkening back to, was made possible by the existence of having two ideologically incoherent political parties. Back then, the parties were not really divided by a hard line of ideology. It was much more divided by interest coalitions and specifically geographical coalitions. And that we live now, for the first time really in American history, in an era of totally ideologically polarized parties, where the parties are not divided by region. They are divided, but broadly speaking, by ideology, or, if you would prefer, by distinct coalitions of interest groups that are in conflict. In a system like that, or in a structure like that, where the parties exist in that state, the constitutional system of government that we have, with the checks and balances, with the three branches, all the shit you learned in junior high, in that system, meaningful cross-party compromise is impossible. In fact, the constitutional structure of the federal government makes any legislative function impossible because it was designed only to work in a system that did not have factional government. That's not me saying that. That is what the founders said at the time. That's what the Federalist Papers said. They said, yeah, this is clearly going to be fucked if factions ever emerge, but it's okay because factions won't emerge. Well, it's now over 200 years later, and we can say with confidence, factions fucking emerged. And this fact, this reality, is something that everyone needs to reckon with to understand where we are and how we can possibly move forward. So I want to start by talking about that document that we all know and love, the beautiful, beautiful parchment that we worship, the one that we're all going to be giving our come tributes to tomorrow on the 4th. That's right, the United States Constitution. Now, the Constitution, as many of you probably know, I would hope, was not the first attempt by the founding fathers, once they defeated Britain, to create a system of government for the erstwhile colonies. There were first the Articles of Confederation, which attempted to create a radically decentralized system of authority with an incredibly weak central government and most power vested in the states. Because one of the foundational realities of American politics is that, and the thing that we have had to deal with ever since, is that the unit of the United States, when it was originally emerging out of its war with its colonial benefactor, the United Kingdom, was that the states had very distinct interests and identities, which meant that the job of creating a nation out of it was really the job of knitting together what felt really more like separate nations than departments, the way that there are departments in France or in the UK. And the first attempt to do that was the Articles. The United States under the Articles was an unwieldy system that, for one thing, had debt from the war era unequally spread throughout the former colonies, different currencies, different trade concepts, and most importantly, different states with different economic structures and systems that were not knitted into a whole and therefore couldn't function as a whole. And so the Constitution came out of the effort to knit these things into a more cohesive whole for these individual states to give up some of their authority in exchange for a more centralized control that allowed for, you could argue, the emergence of finance capitalism, all that stuff with Hamilton, the consolidation of war debt, all the things that led to the emergence of America as a finance-dominated nation. But because there was no gun at the head of anyone, basically, there was no coercion that was going to work, because everyone really did have the authority. All these states didn't really have anything on one another because they did see themselves as separate. It had to be a negotiation. And so the Constitution emerged as the effort to prevent these states from ever feeling overawed or controlled by any of the other states. And that's the important thing, is that the people writing the Constitution, when they looked at the conflicts that had to be assuaged by the system of government they were creating, the chief ones they were thinking of were specifically state-based, region-based, but even more specifically state-based. And as such, that's why you have things like the Senate and the House of Representatives, this elegant system where small states are able to gain some sort of foothold on power by virtue of the Senate, whereas larger states still have influence because of the population-based House of Representatives. So that was all an effort to prevent any of one state from feeling overawed by another. And then, of course, there's the checks and balances that they love to talk about, the three co-equal branches of government, designed to prevent any one power from becoming over-powerful. A president from becoming over-powerful, a legislature from becoming over-powerful, a judiciary from becoming over-powerful. And the thought was that the dangers that needed to be checked against by these by this document were the dangers of some states ganging up on other states in some way, or of one branch of government overawing another branch of government. And we're taught that this system was a beautiful and elegant solution for those problems. And at the time, it appeared to be so, and it has worked to a degree. I mean, the whole sectional issue ended up in a fucking bloody civil war that killed over 500,000 Americans. So even on its own terms, honestly, the United States Constitution wasn't great shakes. The real issue is that all of the elegant checks and balances that are in the Constitution fail completely if government becomes based on coherent and disciplined parties. The checks and balances we were talking about that prevent one branch of government from overawing the others and maintain a system where there's accountability for all, those fail if one faction controls all the branches, which we have now. We've spent the last 3 years watching agog as all of these norms and all of these checks and systems that are supposed to prevent a manifestly corrupt oaf from just doing whatever the fuck he wants without any kind of reckoning have failed to engage. And why? Because a ideologically coherent party that is allied with that president is also in control of the other branches of government, which means that it will never be in their interest to see him held to account, and therefore he won't be. So the checks and balances out the window. Why? Because there's an ideologically coherent party that controls all the branches. And the things that make the government work, the things that allow it to be responsive, the things that allow it to pass laws in the face of crises and in the face of issues and respond to the popular will, those things fall apart if the different branches of government are controlled by different political parties that are ideologically coherent and have discipline, as was the case during the Obama administration after 2010, when Mitch McConnell and the Republican House made it essentially impossible for Obama to govern, and he wasn't able to. Now, the people who wrote the Constitution and patted themselves on the back thinking they'd solved all these issues, they didn't imagine that these would ever come up, even though they were built into the framework itself, because they did not see the real divide being between interest groups that would have a stake in government. The only real divide they saw was, as I said, between state interests, but the other real one, the one that they were counting on preventing the system from breaking down and from these sort of fractions to emerge, was the one between rich and poor, the haves and have-nots. And they were very explicit about this, that the government they were creating was one that was designed to essentially lock the poor out of influence of government, to have minimal to no interest in government. People forget this, but universal manhood suffrage did not exist in most U.S. states until well into the 19th century. And that the original idea for the Electoral College was that there would be no popular vote involved in it at all. State legislatures would meet and appoint electors, and then they would go together and elect a president. There would be no system in which they would be forced to vote for any specific candidate the way they are now, where a state, their popular vote winner in a state, determines how their electors must vote.